Hello everyone, my name's Richard. I'm hosting this initially tonight, and we've got with us today Toby and Dan and Tom. Tom, Toby, myself are members of Bristol Cycling Campaign, and we've got Dan Kelly, who's our guest speaker, who's going to talk a little bit about livable neighbourhoods and low traffic neighbourhoods. So just a little bit of background on Bristol Cycling Campaign. The campaign's been around for around 40 years in various guises, originally as Cycle Bag, and then formed a split into Bristol Cycling Campaign and then Sustrans, who you will all have heard of around 30 years ago now, I think. Tonight, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the kind of wash up from the COVID-19 situation and how we are engaging with Bristol City Council about how to improve cycling in response, and walking, in fact, in response to the COVID-19 situation. Toby's going to do a kind of brief description about what's happened so far and how we might go forward collaboratively with both the general public, but also Bristol City Council and other politicians. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some proposals and challenges we've got for Bristol City Council in response to that. We'll follow it up with a little Q&A, and then we'll throw it over to Dan, who's going to do a short talk on low traffic neighbourhoods. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Toby, who's going to kick it off. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. It's great to see so many people coming along. So as Rich mentioned, I'm going to kick off by talking a little bit about what's happened so far since our country went into lockdown. Obviously specifically looking at what's happened regarding walking and cycling and what we've been doing as the cycle campaign in the background during the lockdown so far. So first of all, I want to mention some of the positive things that have come out of this lockdown, you know, because we have to try and take the positives out of every situation. First of all, we've seen so many people out and about close to their homes, discovering a lot of the green spaces, the pathways, the greenways, little routes around where they live, because they aren't allowed to go any further. So they've really been getting maximum use and maybe even discovering spaces around the city that they didn't even know were there, because by default they would have just driven somewhere before. So that's really good. Furthermore, we've seen a huge amount of families out on our streets taking to cycling and walking as well, like in the image here on the Downs. And this is partly due to the huge reduction in traffic, meaning that those families actually felt safe finally to be able to go out and use those streets. In terms of cycle shops, clearly many industries have been hit very hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, but actually for cycle shops it's been a real boom. There's been a 200% increase in the cycle to work scheme. We've heard anecdotally that some cycle shops have had several 100% increases in sales of bikes, and also, you know, loads of people going to get maintenance done on those bikes that have been in the shed for a number of years and aren't working anymore. So that's really good to see. Then onto the, I guess, one of the downsides of what we've seen. Of course, we've all had to try and follow these social distancing guidelines, which can be difficult, and it's really put the pressure on our network of walking and cycling routes around the city. And what we've seen is some of the key pinch points, which maybe connect big residential areas with the areas of green space, have become very congested, and people have found it really difficult to follow the rules around those areas. So the example you can see in my image here on the right hand side is the Ashton Avenue Bridge down by the Create Centre, where clearly you've got Bristol City Centre and the Harbourside Loop on one side, and on the other side you've got the Grevelsmith Park, the route to Ashton Court, routes further afield as well. So that became very, very congested. So early on in the lockdown, from a Bristol Cycling Campaign perspective, we were really focused on attempting to get those kind of routes where people were trying to get their allowed outdoor exercise done safely. We were trying to make changes to those. So in early April, we wrote to the council, making a few specific requests. One was related to the Ashton Avenue Bridge in the picture, one relating to the circular road on the Downs, and one relating to Avon Crescent, which is nearby to the Ashton Avenue Bridge, asking for those spaces to either be closed off or restricted to motor traffic so that people had the full use of that space. Unfortunately, the only thing that changed was on the Ashton Avenue Bridge, where you'll now see, if you go down there, there's a bollard in the middle of the busway to make it clear that whilst the buses aren't running, you are able to use the full width of that bridge and also the length of the busway itself for your exercise. But unfortunately, that's only a temporary measure, because at some point the buses are going to come back. So now to talk about where we go from here. As we mentioned, we were focused on exercise and things before, but now as we move into the recovery phase, we face a bit of a different challenge, because public transport, we know, is going to be at 20% maximum capacity for quite some time whilst all the social distancing rules are in place. What we don't want is for all of those people who can't fit onto public transport to just jump straight in their cars, because the road capacity can't handle it, and the climate and the earth can't handle it either. So the government has actually asked us all directly to walk or cycle if we can. Also, this bike boom that we've seen during the first phase of the lockdown, we want to work out how we can lock in those benefits really permanently and make sure it's not just a one-off peak in bike usage, but we don't make it last. And the government seems to agree, because the government has instructed all of our councils to make space for walking and cycling. And just to be clear, that is an instruction. They haven't asked or suggested. They have told them to make space for walking and cycling, and they've made £250 million available for councils to do that. So in response, a lot of you will have seen, I'm sure, the first tranche of changes from Bristol City Council, which have been announced. The headline has been the pedestrianisation of the Old City and the closure of Baldwin Street and Bristol Bridge to through traffic. Now, the Old City pedestrianisation in particular, we know was something already on the back burner, but that's fine. We're really happy to see that accelerated and happening a lot quicker. The same with Baldwin Street and Bristol Bridge. We strongly support those proposals from the council, and they're probably the boldest proposals we've seen for a long time. And although they seem like quite small point locations, particularly Baldwin Street and Bristol Bridge, the impact on the wider network and the opportunities that gives us elsewhere for cycling are going to be really crucial. So that's hopefully going to happen by late summer. But the council's also promised as well a network of temporary cycle lanes, mostly focused around the city centre. And really, again, we strongly support those, but with the caveat that they have to be done as quickly as possible, and they have to be implemented in the most robust way, so they're safe and they actually get more people, they allow more people to get out cycling. So whilst we're supportive at the moment, if they're not delivered quickly, we'll clearly put a lot of pressure on the council. So just to give you an idea of what else has been happening around the country, I'm focusing on my slide here on schemes which have actually been delivered rather than promises. There's been a lot of promises from a lot of councils around the country, but really, we want to see those converted into action. So first of all, in London, we've seen a temporary cycle lane gone in on Park Lane, which is probably something that would have been unfathomable a year ago. You can see in the picture that the bus lane has been turned into a protected cycle lane with these plastic bollards in the way, and then a second lane has become a bus lane, and then there's one lane left for motor traffic. In Manchester, the Deansgate has been pedestrianised completely with these planters put in down the middle. Deansgate is probably roughly the equivalent of our Baldwin Street, so a street running right through the heart of the city. Leicester were one of the first cities to install any temporary infrastructure, and they put in this cycle lane alongside one of their major hospitals, and they called that the Key Worker Corridor. Then in London, you've got a great example here of an extended pavement. So on the left-hand side, the tarmac bit with all the chalk painting on it, that's all an extension to the pavement, which has been built since the COVID crisis to allow this clearly very busy area for people to spread out. And a big thank you to Salford for giving me a great example of how not to do it. The intention was right here in providing some hard infrastructure along what was just a dotted line cycle route. Unfortunately, these blocks that have gone down have gone in on the wrong side of the line, so have made a very, very narrow and unusable cycle route. But I am told that that's gonna change. That's all going to be fixed quite soon. So that's the context. Now, what I'm going to propose is how we as the Cycle Campaign would like to work with you, our community, but also with our local authorities collaboratively to make sure that we get the best solutions for Bristol, for the city, and we implement those in the best way, and also we get it done as quickly as possible to lock in those benefits. As a Cycle Campaign, we already do have a really good relationship with people on the technical design side in the council. So we regularly, they consult with us when they're designing new cycle lanes and things, and we do get some influence over the design. But really it's the political side that we'd like to build a better relationship with. And we're very happy to see that we now seem to have the political will to get stuff done. Certainly a lot of the right words have been said, so we want to turn that into action. So our principles in how we will work with the council are these three. First of all, we will listen to the community. As Richard mentioned, the campaign has been around in one form or another for a very, very long time. And we have become experts really at working with the community, understanding what people's problems in terms of cycle lanes, where the problem spots are, and then feeding back one unified view of what's needed and what the solutions are. Number two, it's fair to say that we have been very critical of the council in the past, and we will continue to do so where we think it's right, and where we think there's a genuine need to be critical because something isn't up to standards. But when we are critical, we'll be honest about our reasoning behind that, and we'll be constructive. So we won't just offer criticism, we will also propose solutions. And finally, celebration of success. So if the council does deliver this infrastructure and it works well, we'll recognise that. We won't always complain. We'll celebrate what's been done and the people who've put in the hard work to do it. And I think that's going to be really useful in spurring things on and getting more and more delivered beyond what's already been proposed. So specifically, how can we help as Bristol Cycling Campaign? So this is really our olive branch to the council. Okay, we have a lot of people involved who, particularly at the moment, have a lot of time to spend pro bono towards helping get this stuff done. Some of the skills we have on tap are really quite wide-ranging. We have urban planners, highways engineers, other types of engineers, architects. We have experts in marketing and communications and community engagement. We have data scientists and lawyers. So we have all of the different disciplines you need to take this process through and work out where the cycle infrastructure is needed and make sure it's high quality as well. But most of all, we have a huge group of passionate people who really want to make a difference to the city that they live in and make it a better place. So specifically, what are we going to do? As I've already mentioned, we can handle the engagement with local communities. In other cities around the country, the councils have officially partnered with whatever the local cycling campaign is for collaborative working to find out those problem points and crowdsource all the information from the community, particularly in Manchester, but in other areas of the country as well. Proposing solutions, so we won't just go with the problem. We've also got some very clever people who can come up with the potential solutions as well. So we'll go with the problem and we'll propose one way it could be solved as well. And finally, collaborating with the other organisations in the city, because we recognise Bristol Cycling Campaign is just one of many campaigns related to cycling, walking, active travel, urban living. We already have great relationships with the other organisations, and we'll continue to make sure it's a big picture and we're not purely focused on cycling. So Bristol Walking Alliance, Sustrans, Living Streets, Extinction Rebellion, local community groups, local councillors, we're happy to work with them all to bring together the picture. So that's our olive branch of the council, and we really hope that they will grab hold of that and work with us in the weeks and months going forward, and we get something really good out of this. So thanks, that's my bit over and done with. I'm going to hand over to Rich now, who's going to talk through some specifics in our response to what the council's proposed so far, and after that we'll open it up to some Q&A. So if you've got any questions, please do pop them in the chat, and afterwards our handy assistant Tom is going to read some of them out to us. So thanks very much. Over to you, Rich.
Thanks, Toby. Well, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the proposals that have come forward so far. It's a little bit vague at the minute, but we'll see what we can do. And some proposals that we've been thinking about that could expand on that, and then a little bit about how we can go forward from there, building on some of the things Toby's talked about engagement and consultation and so on. There are kind of three strands to this. One of them is the need for more space for social distancing. That's typically more of a pedestrian issue generally, so we're not going to focus too much on that tonight, but it's obviously a very important issue in here. The second strand is how we enable people to get out on their bikes to accommodate that loss of public transport capacity is going to happen, and the government, as Toby mentioned, have realised that and realised there's a problem coming if we don't deal with it. And so what can we do to see that problem off now, and also with an eye on what's happening in the future and what we've got planned anyway. And the third strand is really how do we lock in the benefits of lockdown. I mean, Toby talked about this already, so I'm not going to go into it anymore, but people have seen how many more kids are out on bikes, how many kind of less typical cyclists have been out and about, and that's absolutely great, and people are discovering how they can cycle around their local area. But we don't want that to disappear when the traffic comes back. So what Bristol City Council proposed a minute? Well, as I said, it's a little bit vague. There's a series of social distancing measures have been proposed for a series of high streets around Bristol, and there's also a series of cycle improvements on various, mostly city centre streets. At the minute, on the screen you can see a map of the city centre area, and you can see how sparse the current separated infrastructure is. You've got the kind of well-used route across along Baldwin Street, east-west route via Castle Park and down towards the bottom of the screen to Prince Street, which are well-used recent bits of infrastructure, but it's quite sparse overall. And enabling people to commute into the city to go to work as people return to work over the coming months, we need to make sure that the city centre is safe for cycling, first and foremost, and legible also for people to get around, people who may not be used to cycling around the city centre. So Toby, can you move on to the next slide? And you can see here, this is some of the sections of cycle route that the council have proposed at the minute. Now, as you can see, it's still quite piecemeal. You've got these existing routes there, we've got bits of it that start to connect in, and we've got some bits scattered around as well. We're not quite sure about the exact extent of this, and we're hoping to hear more from the council over the coming days, weeks and months. And I think the council have been clear that this is the first stage and there should be more coming on afterwards. And the government have been very keen to stress that it's not just about temporary infrastructure that might disappear or rushing stuff now. It's about bringing forward schemes that would plan to be happening anyway and bringing them forward to an appropriate quality. So we want to make sure that happens too. So we've been thinking about, well, how can we build upon some of these proposals that Bristol City Council have already suggested to start to join the dots together to make a city centre route. And you can see here, this is just a few of the proposals we would suggest. Some of them are long-term schemes that we've been talking about for a few years, and some of them are kind of bits that have arisen more recently. Some of these are bits that are included in the WECA West of England Combined Authority's LC-WIP, which is a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan, which is due to be adopted in the coming months. And you can see here, by connecting a few dots together, we can actually start making a usable network, and you really start getting the network benefits of connecting different routes together. And this is kind of a really important area. We recognise the importance of focusing initially, at least, on the city centre. The ambition shouldn't stop there. People have got to get into the city centre if we're talking about commuting, but people also want to be able to travel around their local area, take their kids to school, do runs to local shops and so on. So it has to expand out beyond here, but this would be a good start. Toby, can you move on to the next slide? We talked a little bit about the measures on Baldwin Street, closing off that, and that in itself creates some new opportunities. It essentially creates a fairly low traffic street network south of Baldwin Street in the Queen Square area. And now, once this happens, we'll have one route in and out on the Redcliffe Bascule Bridge, and you'll have one route out on Prince Street Bridge. So one really key ask that I think we're quite keen to press on now, which is probably the biggest no-brainer in active travel in Bristol, is to deal with Prince Street Bridge. It was closed a few years ago, many of you will have remembered, to motor traffic, and it was a bit disruptive for cyclists and pedestrians too, but it didn't cause any major problems to the traffic network in the area. So we're keen to make sure that is reallocated to represent the kind of use of that bridge. And you can see on the right there, we've got 18,000 pedestrians on the day this traffic count was done. Two-way movements across Prince Street Bridge, 5,500 cycle movements, and just 1,700 car movements going the one way that's permitted. In fact, a couple that went the wrong way, but let's not go there. So we want to see that road space reallocated to actually enable social distancing, to improve that in the long run for cycling and walking, and that's something we're really keen to ask. We're aware of the issue about the Bascule Bridge needing to have some renovations next year, so we're conscious of that, and we're calling for a short-term closure of Prince Street Bridge through traffic, recognising that it will have to be open for a temporary period while the Bascule Bridge is being refurbished as that capacity will be needed, and that's fair enough. But that can kind of be a prelude to a kind of long-term closing there, and that starts to create a really kind of low traffic network of streets in that area of Bristol, and then with the old city area that Toby's already talked about, and improve connections to South Bristol. Toby, do you want to move on? Next slide. So what's next? How do we build beyond the city centre? It's not all about city centre. As I said, it makes sense to focus on it to begin with, but there are we need to think more ambitiously about the overall network. You can see there on the left, there's the Department of Transport have got something called the Propensity to Cycle tool, which maps under a number of different scenarios how people might want to travel around based on previous census information, travel around the country, but this is just focused on Bristol here. And using that, the local authorities in this area and the West of England Combined Authority have formed a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. You can see the kind of radial element to that. We know that needs to be engaged with local communities, with other groups, the Cycling Campaign, Bristol Walking Alliance, Sustrans, and so on. So there's a big consultation exercise that the council are promising to go through to the next stage, and we want to see how that, some of which has already been integrated into the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan as a result of that consultation, and we want to see how that could be rolled out. But the next question is, how do you fill those gaps between these radial routes? A lot of the journeys that people take are to local shops, to taking their kids to school, kind of multi-stage trips, and we want to make sure those are enabled too. And so the next big ask, and Dan's going to expand on this a little bit more, is for the idea of low traffic neighbourhoods. And Toby, if you just want to move on to the next slide. I think many of you will be familiar with the principle already. Some of you might not, so I'll just cover very briefly before Dan goes into it. The idea is you restrict through traffic through residential neighbourhoods. Simple as that, really. Motor traffic is diverted around the edge. You have segregated cycle routes around the edge, and around the middle you've got a network of quiet streets that kids can play in, people can walk in, people can cycle through. And you can do it really easily, you can do it really cheaply, you can do it really quickly with these modal filters, which could just be a bollard or a planter in the middle of the street. So that's the kind of next step, how you fill those gaps between those big routes. And that's what we want Bristol City Council to really kind of take up. We know they're looking at it. So we'd like to hear more from them about that and see how we can start rolling that out. And as you can see on the right there, we've already looked at some options for kind of testing some options for how you might take a neighbourhood in Bristol and turning it to a low traffic street network. And I think there's loads of opportunities in Bristol to do that. Some areas already have bits of modal filtering in there that kind of create that effect. Southfield, for one, has a kind of accumulation of changes that have happened over the years. But we'd like to see that kind of roll out kind of over the whole of Bristol, and certainly the inner areas of Bristol where they can really benefit from the kind of Victorian street network that we've got here. I appreciate that's a really quick rush through, but we've got a lot to cover through tonight. I think Toby, I think we're going to some questions and answers first before we move on to Dan. Is that correct?
Yep, that's it. So we'll hand over to Tom. Yep.
Hi everyone. First of all, amazing to see how many people we've got on this webinar. We've got 110 people on this webinar, which is amazing. So we've got a question. I won't read out who they're all from, but we've got a question: what can be done to help people who are new to cycling and or returning to cycling? Someone kindly mentioned in the chat that our friends at Life Cycle are doing their one-to-one lessons again, which I believe are free. So do get in touch with Life Cycle about them. We had a question from Holly on whether there is evidence that new cycle lanes encourage a shift to cycling, or whether they just benefit those that are already cycling. So I don't know whether either Richard or Toby, you're more expert in this than myself. Want to take that one?
Shall I take the first one, Toby take the second? As new cyclists, well, it's great that Life Cycle are able to renew their activity and do this really important behavioural change work. I would say that for all the behavioural change that you can do, the only way you can really maintain cycling levels and keep people cycling is if you've got safe infrastructure for people to cycle on, whether that means quiet streets through kind of low traffic neighbourhoods, or whether it's segregated cycling infrastructure. If you don't have that as a fundamental basis, then I think you can do a lot of behavioural change and not get much effect. So behavioural change is an important part of it, but it can spur that transition. It's not necessarily going to enable a transition on its own. So I think I mean, Toby might have some more to say on that, but I'll let him answer the second question.
I think you almost covered it, but just to say that when we have had new cycle lanes go in the city, particularly Baldwin Street and Prince Street, we have done before and after counts and seen a huge increase in the numbers of people using those routes. Clearly, some of those would have already been cyclists who, would have taken a different route maybe, but I'm certain that some of those will be new cyclists as well. And the closer we get to an actual joined up network of safe routes, which we're just starting to get towards now in the city centre, the more new cyclists we'll see. But I think the number of people we've seen out on the roads of Bristol on their bikes whilst the traffic has been low shows that, if you take away the danger, people will get out there.
I'd also add to that if you're aware, there's a YouTube channel called Street Films, and they do a really nice short film about 6 or 7 minutes long about Seville, and essentially they just built loads of cycle lanes really quickly, and the number of people cycling has shot up from barely anyone at all to now, it's very common to cycle, men, women, children, all cycling in Seville at the moment. We had a question on the importance of the quality of cycle lanes and not just putting them in as soon as possible, especially managing that relationship with pedestrians, conscious of some of the shared space that exists at the moment.
Shall I take that one? We're really keen, particularly on the issue of the pedestrian cycle conflict, not to kind of be in a kind of divide and rule situation in this. A city which is going to be good for cycling is going to be, on the whole, good for walking, and a city which is good for walking and pedestrians is, on the whole, going to be good for cycling. So we try and work closely with Bristol Walking Alliance, in particular when we're kind of working in Bristol and lobbying and responding to consultations and all that other work, because we're very keen that we don't allow cycling campaign and walking campaigns and advocates to be played off against each other. There are issues to be resolved, and we're very much in favour of making sure new infrastructure is adequately segregated, so you've got that distinction between pedestrian routes and cycle routes, and that's really important for people who are visually impaired, for example, to make sure that it's safe for everybody, whether you be a kind of 80-year-old walking along or kind of a new cyclist on what would have been a busy road previously. So we're very conscious of the fact that we need to kind of accommodate both, and it shouldn't be a divide and rule situation for those people who just want to obstruct change.
Okay, that's great. We have a comment about enforcement needed for speeding. I know that nationally there's been a speeding campaign launched, I think yesterday, and Avon and Somerset Police said they would be partaking in that because speeds have increased dramatically across the country. We do also have a team within the cycle campaign that we call Road Justice, who work with Avon and Somerset Police, trying to make sure they are obviously enforcing the law and prosecuting those that are a danger to those on a bike. We've got a question for Pamela, maybe for you, Toby. Why do we extend an olive branch to the council?
I think, it's a good point. We've, for a long time, we've been very critical of the council because we haven't seen an awful lot delivered, particularly in recent years in terms of cycle infrastructure. But what we do know, because of our relationships with the officers working in the background, we know that there are some really ambitious plans which exist. And because we've seen this political will shift both on a national level and a local level, at the moment we plan to capitalize on that and try and work to get those that political will turned into something realistic. Now, if nothing happens, then clearly we're gonna be changing our tune, and we will be critical. But at the moment, things are moving in the right direction, so we're going to be supportive.
Okay, we've got a couple of comments about the referencing a mapping system. Maybe people have picked up on the fact that other councils have a mapping system to flag up comments. Can either of you update us on where we think the council are at with that?
My understanding is that the council are going to make use of the Commonplace app, which has been offered free to local authorities. We're not quite sure how the consultation process is going to be rolled out. And there's also the kind of old-fashioned way as well. I mean, there's a real role for people in their local communities to speak to your ward councillors, to speak to people who are connected in your area, to kind of push forward your kind of case in your area as well. And that's what we're going to be starting to do as well. We've already begun that, in fact. But we don't know exactly how the council's consultation process is going to run. It's worth noting though that the council did run quite a long consultation on the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan, which got a lot of comments, and they're working through a lot of stuff for individual routes already, but there's a long way to go. Okay,
we've got a comment from Tom on e-scooters. To be fair, Tom, we haven't really discussed e-scooters and our thoughts on this as a campaign yet, but we'll put it on the agenda, and if you want to come to one of our meetings and talk about e-scooters, that would be great. We've got a comment from Joe on the increase in use of e-bikes, and but there's a lack of secure storage in town. I guess especially if you don't work in an office with an underground bike park. I don't know if we've any thoughts on that. I mean, speaking to the council, they don't really have funding for storage of bike hangers or such like at the moment at all, let alone for e-bikes. But yeah, maybe the business improvement districts of the city centre may have some funding if that's what businesses want to see. I don't know, Richard and Toby, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, the conversations that we have with developers, either professional or through the campaign, I mean, it's increasingly developers redeveloping city centre sites, or building in city centre particularly, and elsewhere, understanding that you can't accommodate car use in new developments, and actually the only way you can deal with the kind of getting people to work and options for people living in new developments in the city centre is to have adequate cycle storage. That's being seen rather than just a kind of add-on that you have to have because of planning. Actually, people understanding that's really important to build into things. So storage, and that covers kind of storage within buildings, and then there's also obviously a role for kind of rolling out more cycle storage more generally, and things like bike hangs are going to be really important in that as well.
We've got just a reference point from John Usher from Sustrans on the brilliant Bristol Bike Life report that Sustrans carried out. Some really good data on how many people would like to cycle but feel unsafe, or how many people from different backgrounds of the city could cycle or would like to cycle. It's a really useful document if anyone needs some evidence to go to their councillors with. I think we'll just take this as the last question on why other cities have managed to move more quickly over the last few weeks. I know there's a lack of money at the moment within the council for this directly. Richard and Toby, I don't know whether you want to just touch on this as the last question.
I think it's important to look beyond the headlines. We have seen big numbers from places like Liverpool, Manchester, London, but when the examples I showed were actually some of the few that have actually been implemented so far. So in terms of action on the ground, not that much apart from fixed locations has happened already. But you're right, we are behind the curve, and it seemed it took a little bit longer to get that shift in our local council than we would have liked. Rich, I don't know if you can add anything, but I don't.
I broadly agree. I think that the shift in tone has been very encouraging. Obviously, that's been driven by the recent announcement from central government. In terms of actual stuff on the ground, we're not seeing anything yet. Some of the stuff that's been proposed is just stuff that we knew were kind of going to happen anyway. That said, when we look at you have a tendency to look around at the kind of best things happening in all other cities in Britain and around the world. Birmingham are now looking at rolling out 20-mile-an-hour zones in residential areas. So it's something we did 4 or 5 years ago. So we have to put that into some level of context. But I think we could be a lot more ambitious. Funding is always an issue, but we'll see how that plays out in the coming months when the funding arrives from central government.
Okay, we will call it a day on those questions because want to move on to Dan, but we can save the questions, I believe, and we can maybe do a bit of a document online if people have got further questions or comments. But I think that probably captures most of the feeling of the chat. But keep the questions coming, and we'll have a Q&A with Dan and maybe a couple of questions at the end. And use the hashtag if you are on Twitter tweeting about this webinar. Okay, shall we transfer to Dan, Toby?
Yep, Dan, hopefully you should have the ability to share your screen if you need to.
All right. Small child bollards, right? Affirm, thumbs up. All right. I'm going to rattle through this because I'm conscious of time, and I think that with all these things, the Q&A is often where we get the most interesting discussion. So my name's Dan Kelly, and I've been volunteering in Waltham Forest for about 6 years. And I first came into volunteering around active travel because I was interested in reducing rat running around where I lived, around the park where I was involved with the park users group. Along to a cycle campaign meeting, and they really impressed me, so I got involved there. Latterly, we created the We Support Waltham Forest Mini-Holland group, which was a broader group with a sort of healthy streets, better streets feel, so it encompassed people who walked and used public transport, and so less of a focus on cycling and more on general tackling car dominance. And I've one of the things that's come out of Waltham Forest Mini-Holland is we've had huge amounts of interest in the programme and the schemes within the programme. So we've had more than 100 groups of delegates in for study tours, and so it's been a real privilege to showcase the borough to people over time. So I'm going to talk about physical activity first up, a bit about induced demand, a bit about creating a low traffic neighbourhood, some of the results from Waltham Forest, campaigning a little bit perhaps, and maybe we'll get onto wider area if we have time. So broadly, low traffic neighbourhoods are about increasing physical activity, and we know from Public Health England and the Chief Medical Officer that the possible benefits from everyone in the UK getting the amount of physical activity they need are extremely wide-ranging, and not just about health. And it's been described on a number of occasions as a wonder drug. Some of the guidance from the Chief Medical Officer in recent years has used the stat of 37,000 deaths per year could be prevented if people got the amount of physical exercise they should be getting. And there is lots of evidence that it can be used, prescribed, if you like, physical activity to tackle things like lung disease, heart disease, cancer, obesity, diabetes, and in fact, it can help with child development, tackle mental health and the stress and anxiety associated, and even social cohesion isolation can be tackled with people moving around more in their local neighbourhoods. So it really is, I think wonder drug isn't an understatement at all. But when we start to fiddle about with the status quo around people's driving convenience, those people who do drive or do have access to a private car, then people can get very twitchy. And those of you in Bristol involved in the Eastern engagement a few years ago will know all about that. Here's some photos I picked up on the web, those suggesting that when we filter out through traffic from our neighbourhoods, we create Carmageddon, shall we say, on our main roads. And I think so. I just wanted to talk briefly on that because we're all going to hear that. If we've probably, a lot of us have already heard that on this call. I know because some of the people on the call, I've had a little spin through to see who's on. I think it's really important to understand why people drive, and the low traffic neighbourhoods is about those short trips and why people drive incredibly short trips. And in London, it's way more than a third, something like 36-37% of all daily trips are less than 2 kilometres. 2 kilometres, not miles, kilometres. So it's all about the decisions that people make, the complex decisions that people make about how they travel. And there's lots, but I'm just going to bang through a couple here, 2 or 3, 4. A big one is existing car ownership. And when you combine that with poor public transport, infrequent buses, poor rail services, or long walks to rail services, then people are going to choose the car every time. Subsidised on-street vehicle storage. If it's free to park a private vehicle outside your home, that is subsidised. It's not free to maintain that space for the local authority. Everyone is paying for general taxation for that. And so any free parking is subsidised in some way, be that publicly or privately. And most roads are free at point of use. You know, the NHS is free at point of use because we all pay for it. It's exactly the same for roads. Once you have a car, you feel like you're not paying. But what low traffic neighbourhoods look to tackle is the convenience of very, very high capacity local road networks. And I don't just mean very wide motorways with multiple lanes. I mean where a neighbourhood has almost all the streets available as through routes. They add to the capacity of a road network, very many route options, because you know when you go for a short drive in your car, if you get into a queue at the signals, you've got other options, and it makes it convenient. It feels convenient, and you decide to drive. So that's just a little bit about induced demand. I won't go on too much more. I could go on. If you ever get me in the pub, I will go on about it. Talk briefly about creating an access-only neighbourhood. Over the 5 or 6 years I've been talking about low traffic neighbourhoods, I've come to call them access-only because I think it's a little bit more intuitive. what you're doing is converting streets to access only. We're not actually closing roads. Closing roads suggests a barrier at each end of the road. When we create low traffic neighbourhoods, we're invariably putting in point closures, as the traffic planners call them, and they can be as little as a metre and a half of the actual road space is closed, and the rest of the street remains access only for motor vehicles, deliveries, and visitors, etc., etc. I know that the Cycle Campaign from previous slides on this session have looked at areas that are suitable. Generally, they're sort of 1 to 2 kilometres square kilometres. Some of the schemes, low traffic neighbourhood schemes in Waltham Forest have had around about 5,000 households, broadly that sort of size. We're looking for obvious boundaries, main roads, but sometimes railway lines, canals, that sort of thing, rivers. And as I said, those point closures or modal filters, as they're also known because they filter out just full-size motor vehicles, can be large planters or bollards in the carriageway or gates as well. You can even have camera control gates, so there's actually no physical barrier there. There's some of those in Waltham Forest. We have some that run from 10 till 10 a.m., 10 p.m, allows loading for businesses before 10 a.m. And in fact, a bus-only gate operates in Waltham Forest, and there are other ones in London where a fairly small sort of minibus can pass through the gates, but no private vehicles. And in fact, some of our low traffic neighbourhoods are complemented with physical. You've got a combination, shall we say, of physical bollards or planters, camera control gates, and also one-way streets, which, when combined, ensure there are no routes through at all. Because actually, even if you leave a very circuitous route through a residential neighbourhood, there will be those drivers who will pass through, and they're unlikely to drive in a really desirable way. So here's an example of a planter that's filtered a railway bridge in Walthamstow. This was back in 2015, I think. Network Rail actually paid for this closure because the bridge was quite weak. Several thousand vehicles a day over this bridge at one time. You can see that this is actually quite a long closure. It's about 20 metres there because there's no frontages and there's no access to there. So that's since been replaced with lockable wooden bollards, actually, in that case. So a quick example of, if you have got a few more pounds, this is perhaps I should point out that to some extent I am talking in pre-lockdown terms here, the days when we had a little bit more money and we could really make our modal filters or point closures look really special. But of course, if you were to implement a low traffic neighbourhood, it was successful. There's nothing to say that in the future you couldn't come back and create quality public space from those sections of street that have been closed. So, you know, planter now, rain gardens, tree pits, and the sort of quality features you see in that picture. That is in Waltham Forest as well. That one there is rather nice. A quick before and after. I think a lot of people, there will always be, I'm not going to say a lot of people, there will always be those who struggle to imagine what road layouts might look like when they're not optimized for motor cars, because we've been optimizing our road layouts and retrofitting our suburbs, Victorian, Edwardian suburbs, and later for the motor car for 50 years now. So it's difficult for people to imagine what we might mean. So here's a nice before and after from Walthamstow. The street was a one-way street, and it's a very popular walking route. And actually, there's some sort of public art up there, and it's a popular walking route to a local girls' school as well. So we have had some great results from Waltham Forest. Waltham Forest had their schemes were across a number of fronts. So we had some cycleways to link town centres. We had a sort of cycle superhighway, if you like, along Lee Bridge Road, which actually sucked up a lot of the money. It's a 4.4 kilometre fully protected cycleway, fully protected through all junctions with signals as well. And then there was the low traffic neighbourhoods, which we're talking about tonight, but also there was a big complementary measures and behaviour change element as well. So some of the results that have come in from third-party studies commissioned in the early days of Waltham Forest Mini-Holland have been really positive and been picked up by the press. London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Westminster did Dr. Rachel Aldred did some work on that. Some of you may have heard of her, and King's College as well. When we compare parts of London, neighbourhoods of London that have the low traffic type interventions, and compare them to areas that do not, we see that people in this particular study by Dr. Rachel Aldred were walking 32 minutes more per week than those who lived in areas that had not been treated. And that is, you know, when we think about the public health benefits of just being a little bit more active, not a lot, not turning into a sports person. That's really, really significant. Slightly less for cycling, but it's certainly there. And also that in the high dose, if you like, low traffic neighbourhood and Mini-Holland areas, people are 24% more likely to have picked up a cycle of some kind in the previous week and used it. Another piece of work was from King's College London. They're very famous for their air quality work and looking at they did some modelling, and the modelling was around various things, including nitrogen dioxide, and their modelling results came out that the reductions that would come from the interventions that had been put in and were planned under the Mini-Holland programme in the borough would see the borough's population gain 204,000 life years over a lifetime. And so that's amongst a population of several hundred thousand. So some really interesting results there. I've got links to all this stuff. Afterwards, I've got a big link sort of batch to share with everyone, keep you occupied for the next couple of weeks, at least till lockdown is done, maybe. So yeah, it's been picked up by the press, and we've had some really, really good feedback on this. So in order for this to work in Waltham Forest, yes, there was a big change in an up tempo in political will, and yes, there was that relatively generous funding from Transport for London, generous for active travel, not generous in road building terms by any means, a drop in the ocean, but generous in active travel. But what had to happen was the transformation actually of our campaign, and Bristol Cycling reps on this call have already talked about this on a number of points tonight, and it really helps as a campaign to have the Mini-Holland bid, the overall plan that the local authority put together for Waltham Forest Mini-Holland, because it was like a master plan. It showed everywhere that we were going to intervene. So whenever we were talking to people, they say, well, that's all very well here, but what about there? We had something to refer to. So a citywide strategy is really essential. Something where everyone who's working towards traffic reduction can refer to, you know, from council officers to delivery partners, local campaigners. And the strategy really needs to say, you know, when we're tackling the negative impacts of car dependency, inaction is not an option. And we really need sort of, you know, a global citywide or region-wide buy-in for that. City leaders really need to be on board with that from the get-go, from the outset. And, you know, because it's going to be a rocky ride. If you're going to do something that's transformative, genuinely transformative, it's going to be rocky. You know, the conversation needs to be one of, this is what we're going to be doing. Here's the strategy if you'd like to read it. And here is how you can help to shape it. So in Waltham Forest, we quite quickly, after the Mini-Holland Award came in early 2014, which was the commitment to fund, we started to widen the conversation away from cycling. You know, that's absolutely key. I mean, I could just stop there, really. It's absolutely key. We created the We Support Waltham Forest Mini-Holland group, and since then, lots and lots of non-cycling specific active travel groups have been created in London. Better Streets for Enfield is a really successful one, but in fact now Oxfordshire Livable Streets has been created as well. I think Scott's on the call, utter legend Scott. So just a big shout out to Scott right now. And I think, you know, when we think about our campaigns, we really need to make sure we've got our best communicators in the front line, doing liaison with those hard-pressed, time-poor people in delivery, the thankless task of delivery in local authorities and delivery partners as well. Generally, all they do is get bashed. Even in Waltham Forest, where they were doing wonderful, wonderful things for active travel, whenever I met with people in delivery, they'd say, oh, damn, we're getting so much grief. You know, and this is a local authority who's got a really good rep for doing good things. So just, you know, being able to relate and empathize and recognize the constraints that your that your borough officers and decision makers are under, and the sort of noise they're likely to be getting is really important. So your communicators need to be great at empathising, and over time you could then build that trust. Now it's obvious that Bristol Cycling Campaign have already started to do that on a number of fronts, but it needs to keep going, obviously, and and building trust with the community groups, be it church groups, a resident association, the walking alliance you talked about, but also decision makers, portfolio holders in the local authority, and the delivery partners as well, be that the term contractors who construct or people like Sustrans. So that's incredibly important as well. That genuine collaboration and that trust built over time will help to generate political will as well. So we've talked about how actually political will is starting to emerge in Bristol, but we need to keep it going, and we can help to generate more through spending time and empathising. I'd also say, especially with low traffic neighbourhoods, that a trial is a great approach. It helps people to feel like they've got more control and that it's an experiment, and if it's not right, we can change it. So trials really important. I would always push for 18-month trials. 6 months isn't long enough, 12 months maybe just about. Apologise for the door slamming in the background, it's the wind. And also monitoring before and after, traffic volumes and air quality as well. So I am starting to rush along a bit. Where are we at? Inaction is not an option. So that region-wide strategy we talked about, all the other things that we need to talk about. So when you start talking about a particular area with particular people who live in the area and stakeholders within a particular area, they'll start talking about, what about the main roads? What about the next neighbourhood? You're just shifting the problem around. So there's lots of things that we should be talking about and looking at, and perhaps commissioning feasibility studies into for the boundary roads, but also the next neighbourhood, which is again why that region-wide strategy is really, really key. So pedestrian priority at side roads, things like continuous footways, neighbourhood links, so linking into the next low traffic neighbourhood with parallel crossings or signal crossings, a blanket 20 mile an hour within the low traffic neighbourhood 100% every time, but for the main road as well, that's really key. Parking controls. If you haven't got any parking controls within your within the area that you're considering treating for an LTN, you are going to quite likely to have people who are driving into the area to park to use perhaps local transport, that sort of thing. It's really not going to help to have excess vehicle movements coming into the area, moving around looking for parking spots, school streets and safe routes to school. When we're planning LTNs, we can plan and look at where local schools are, whether they're inside the area or not, and how people might get there. School streets is timed closures, restrictions in motor traffic movements around schools at pick up and drop off. Protected cycleways on the main roads. I'm sure you guys will be calling for that. Major junctions need to be looked at. I was working on a feasibility study for a low traffic neighbourhood recently, and the major junctions around this scheme area, several of them had no signal phase pedestrians on 4 3-lane each way junctions. So there were huge junctions in suburban London with no signal phase whatsoever. Just go for it. All it had was drop curbs. And of course, commit to the next low traffic neighbourhood. If you do this neighbourhood, what's going to happen over here? Well, we're going to look at that. That's where that strategy comes in. Quick before and after. This is a main road in Waltham Forest. You can see on the left there's no footway at all. And air quality, Mayor's Air Quality Fund a few years ago paid for this shared cycle. Well, it's actually a cycleway only, but a lot of people walk there because there's no footway. It's not ideal, but in terms of the amount, what you can do when there's hatching. I mean, hatching is just like free space, isn't it? Really great. And this is was actually in one of the slides of Bristol Cycling Campaign earlier on. This is Alford Road in Walthamstow, which now has a camera control gate. It was formerly 2,000 to 3,000 vehicles a day. It's actually quite a popular little place for restaurants, and it's been totally transformed under the Mini-Holland programme. It is where our study tours often end, and if you ever see a Transport for London presentation, it will probably have an Alford Road slide in it. I'm going to call it a day because I think we've been talking for longer than I imagined. Yeah, thanks guys.
Okay, thanks Dan. If you're okay to stick around, we've got loads of questions.
Cool.
We've got from Duncan, we've got what could be your one big call to action that brought people on side, or if you had a sentence to sum up why low traffic neighbourhoods are a great thing.
Yeah, that's why I just spoke about it for 20 minutes, because I can just sum it up in one question, in one line. They're a great thing because they enable walking and cycling and getting together for those who are least likely to have a voice. Children, older people, isolated people, those on lower incomes who are much less likely to have access to private cars. So they are the great leveller, in my view. Unfortunately, they do tend to be campaigned for by people who look like me, which is not ideal. But with really good engagement and bringing the right people on board, you can make a good case, a good social justice case. Social justice is key with this, in my view.
Okay, that's a really good point, and we know that our current Bristol Mayor is very keen on social justice, as he should be. But we've got a comment around the increase in trees that could be planted if certain roads were to have a filter in there, and how the cycle campaign could link up with the Bristol Tree Forum. We've got a very straightforward question, but might not be a straightforward answer, in that this seems, if there's access is remained and car parking has remained, why do people object to a low traffic neighbourhood?
I think there's a range of reasons. What normally happens is, when you explain, if someone objects to the sacrificing any iota of their driving convenience, even when you explain that it's access only, it just means that instead of being able to access your home via 3 or 4 routes off main roads, it's 1 or 2 now. If they continue to argue, you might hear, oh, what about the emergency services? Well, emergency services are statutory consultees in emergency traffic orders and standard traffic orders, and there's been no objections in Waltham Forest, and we've installed over 50 modal filters in the last 6 years. I think if people continue to argue at that stage, then they really just need to be heard, and actually it's time to say, right, great, and then you move on to the next person. It's not, as a campaigner, your energy is limited. You have those discussions, you explain the situation, you give them a little bit of evidence, and if they continue to bang their head against the wall in front of you, then you listen, and then you move on. But yeah, there will be always those who object despite the facts and data.
And one thing on that, if the council do roll out their mapping system, which we obviously hope that they will, that will allow people to put comments on there about cars that are driving too fast, areas where they're difficult to cross or difficult to cycle. So that will build up a real, amount of data for us to go to the council to then ask them to do something about that. We've got a question from Alice, who's the director of an amazing organisation called Playing Out, and I'm sure.
Hi, Alice.
Take a keen interest in all of this. She said, what's a feasible timescale for rolling out a low traffic neighbourhood?
I kicked off my campaigning for a low traffic neighbourhood by running Play Streets, and so I'm a big Alice Ferguson fan. Play Streets was one of the ways that I engaged and started the conversation in my streets and the streets around my area about the idea of low traffic neighbourhoods, was by getting people out, having kids playing in the street. What was the question again?
What's a feasible timescale? If we said, okay, we're going to do it, today, what could be a feasible timescale?
You know what? That's a really difficult question to answer. But what I will say is this: is that it needs to be reasonably prompt. Right now, in this situation, it needs to be incredibly prompt. In fact, we probably need to skip some of the engagement stuff to get this stuff done. In the old days, let's say, you really do need to keep things rolling on. So if you run a feasibility study looking at traffic, and you do a perception survey and ask people about how they feel about the amount of traffic on their street and all the rest of it, you get the feeling, sort of open-ended feeling. You do some traffic counts and some surveys. If you then look at that data and then you don't do anything for 6 months or a year, you're likely to lose those people that you've engaged. So I think going from the feasibility stage to concept and co-design, bringing people together, bringing them into workshops and working out the detail with stakeholders and the experts in the community, the people who live there, that needs to be quite confined. Sometimes, you know, these things get drawn out because funding comes from 2 different financial years, but broadly, once you start engaging with the neighbourhoods, you really need to move it on quick, because if people get interested and then you sod off and twiddle your thumbs and think about it for ages, you could, you lose it, as it were.
Okay, we've got a couple of comments on if you would bring in a low traffic neighbourhood in one area, would that then just push the traffic to the neighbouring area?
So this is why I really like the approach that the London Borough of Lewisham have done. So in their most recent local infrastructure plan has a huge part about low traffic neighbourhoods. And what they did was to take the whole borough and work out where all the cells were, all the logical cells with the natural boundaries to remove through traffic from. And so that means that they're able to put a pipeline together, a set of timescales of when they'll do these things. And when you have a discussion with someone who's a resident in one of the early cells, they can say, yeah, well, what about the next place? What aren't you just pushing the traffic over there? So what, some of it may go over there, some of it may evaporate, but actually we're going to be looking at that area next year. So this is why the sort of master plan, and you know, in Waltham Forest, the Mini-Holland bid document, which was like our master plan, borough-wide plan, was really important tool for people engaging, I think. So it does need to be part of a bigger plan and not just piecemeal.
Okay, and on that, the West of England cycling and walking plan for Bristol includes reference to a pilot of a low traffic neighbourhood for Southville and for St Werburgh's, but a pilot by 2024, which feels a long way off, and no sort of network of low traffic neighbourhoods. So in response to that, the campaign are looking at putting some proposals together. We've done, are we on four proposals this week of where they could sit in quite easily. We've got a question for Richard and Toby on why did Eastern Safer Streets fail?
Well, I could probably give an answer, but I can see John Usher's on the call, so I'm wondering if I can, maybe if I unmute him, he might be able to help.
Oh, you've thrown him under
the
bus.
no,
throw it
I'm prepared.
to John.
Well, really simply, it was as Dan said, I think there was a drawn out engagement process. So as Sustrans delivered the engagement process, we had a lot of lessons to learn as a result of how we worked on that project, but we worked within a framework that of working in partnership with the local authority. I think the other thing that was really key was the fact that it was left to ward members, local ward members, to make the final call on whether or not effectively the formal traffic regulation orders proceeded or not. And I think they were thrown under the bus a little bit because they were stuck effectively between a large part of the community that wanted it and a very, very vocal minority of the community that desperately didn't want it. There was the downside of the vocal minority not wanting it was that they were principally from Black and minority ethnic groups who, and again, as a lesson learned from Sustrans' perspective, had failed or had not engaged in the kind of co-design process that we'd run, and that was a failing on the engagement process itself. So lots and lots of lessons, culpability on numerous sides. But yeah, it was a drastic shame that it didn't happen. And we were going through that probably at around about the same time as Waltham Forest were going through their Mini-Hollands programme. yeah, so we didn't have anywhere else necessarily to learn from at that time either, of how to do it differently. So
okay, thank you, John.
There's a really, just come back on. I think there's the great strength we have now, and anything coming forward in future, is that we can just put pictures of Waltham Forest Mini-Holland and show people and show before and afters. And there's such a really good example now in this country about how it can be done well. I think it probably took a bit of a shift in people's thinking to get people to understand what was being proposed. Now we've got a really good example. I think it's going to be easier to sell that.
To be frank, if Waltham Forest Mini-Holland program is more than a dozen schemes, the most controversial ones were the low traffic neighbourhoods, because those are the ones that significantly impacted on people's driving convenience. If decision making been devolved down to a ward level, like to the specific ward, it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened. It happened because we had good strategic view at portfolio level, and we had a good master plan in the bid document itself. That's what happened. I don't think that the engagement with Waltham Forest was better engagement than any local authority in London has ever done. It still wasn't good enough in my view. I still don't think we engaged Black, Asian, ethnic minority groups sufficiently. But ultimately, there's not so much different between what happened in Easton and what happened in Waltham Forest, really.
Okay, thank you, John. We've just got a final point on the actual sort of shopping high street there, and we know from studies that Sustrans and others have done that a lot of businesses overestimate the number of customers that come by car, and yeah, as the picture showed that Dan showed, it's a really nice place, and it's a really nice place to sit outside the restaurants that are there, and yeah, could be recreated in many parts of Bristol if we wanted it to. A couple of people have asked if we can look at proposals for their areas, Eastville, Easton again. And yeah, as you can see by the slide that's on at the moment, we are looking at proposals, and some of our team are looking at how this might practically work. We've got Redcliffe in the centre of town there, and St Werburgh's there. And yeah, happy to speak to anyone about those. I think we'll wrap up there because it's very kind of Dan to come on, and we don't want to keep him all night. Someone has actually asked Dan if you can come back and do a workshop on engagement. And yeah, I know that yourself and Simon Monk are brilliant at how to sort of get that message across.
That's very kind. You know what? One thing I should be really clear on before I go. So I spent 5 or 6 years volunteering, doing loads of engagement, study tours, all sorts of stuff in Waltham Forest. But last year in September, I quit my long-term IT job for a global multinational and went to work for Sustrans.
Oh, well, there we go. And I think one thing that's come up through
Cards on the table.
The call that is that there is appetite for this, and the Cycle Campaign need to work better with other groups like Playing Out, Sustrans, the Walking Alliance, School Streets, to try and collaborate on this, and we are working on that as we speak. So thank you to Dan for coming along. It's great
My
to
pleasure.
lean on your experience, and I'm sure we will be continuing to do so as a campaign over the next few months. Thanks to Toby and Richard for all the work they did on this at relatively short notice as well. We only had the idea a couple of weeks ago. And thank you to everyone that's come. We're still on 94 participants, so we obviously haven't bored too many people throughout the process. As you can see, we're on all the social media. Do follow on whichever one you use, or all of them if you're really bored during lockdown. We've
use the hashtag.
Yeah, use the hashtag. We've got a survey out at the moment on just gathering people's thoughts on cycling in Bristol. We've just ticked over 700 responses, so an amazing number of people have filled that out. The link is on the screen there, or on our Twitter. If someone can pop that survey link in the chat, that would be great. do sign up as a member if you want. You'll receive our newsletters. It's free for a year. And finally, if you want to get involved in joining our meetings, they're every Tuesday at 7:30 on Zoom. And if you contact us in the contact us form on the website, we can send you all the details. We're really keen to get more people involved, to get more diversity in the group, more parents in the group. But having said that, the number of volunteers has pretty much doubled over the past year. And yeah, it's amazing to see the level of engagement in everything we're doing. Yeah, thank you very much for coming. If anyone's got some questions on the way we work as a campaign, I'll stick around for 10 minutes or so and have a look at those. But if not, thank you very much for coming, and yeah, do get involved in what we're doing.